on involving children and young people in research with Professor Laura Lundy, a rights-based approach. And before I introduce our speaker, Laura, I'm going to hand over to Professor Veronica Lambert, who's the DCU lead in the PPI network based at DCU, and then to Dr. Edel Murphy, who's the National Programme Manager for the PPI Ignite network. So over to both of you first to open the seminar series and to introduce the PPI network.
Thanks, Danielle. On behalf of the PPI Ignite network at Dublin City University, I'm delighted to welcome everybody here today to the first of our special series of a seminar that is related to public and patient involvement with children and young people. And it's great to see such extensive interest in the seminar series, but also particularly the first session today. We hear from Professor Lundy. And just we have representations from patient public members and organisations, researchers, clinicians, and researchers and academics across the numerous institutions, both here in Ireland and abroad. And I suppose we're delighted to particularly be running this, having developed and running this series in collaboration with the National Programme Office, which is our, I suppose, first collaboration as part of the new National Patient Public Involvement Network that has been led out by NUI Galway. So I'm delighted that Edel is able to join us here today. And I suppose I just finished making an acknowledgement to the funders of both the work at DCU and the National Network, the Health Research Board of Ireland and the Irish Research Council. So I'll hand over to you, Edel.
Thanks very much, Veronica. So as Veronica and Danielle have mentioned, I'm here representing the National PPI Ignite network. And many of you on the call will be aware of the very recent establishment of this network. We're alive and well since the 1st of March, building on the previous PPI Ignite programme, also funded by the HRB and IRC. The network, we have 7 universities co-lead sites in the network, 10 national partners and 53 local partners. The network is led out by Professor Sean Deneen here at NUI Galway, which is where I'm located as well, where the National Programme Office is. And our aim is to, it's a really exciting time for public and patient involvement in Ireland. And our overall aim is to provide a shared voice for PPI in Ireland, where PPI practitioners, contributors, organisations and researchers will have a forum for coming together and sharing information and expertise. So it really is excellent, very, very good that we've had this opportunity to collaborate with our colleagues in DCU around the seminar series. PPI involving children and young people, hearing their voice and having children and young people influence research about children and young people is a really important topic at a national level, and one that I know there's a lot of interest in all the universities and organisations around the country. So it's a great first initiative as a programme office, national programme office, to be involved in. And there's an excellent lineup of speakers over the next number of months on this topic. So it's a really positive place for us to start. So back to you now, Danielle.
Thanks, Edel. And so I'm going to introduce Laura. And for those of you that know her, you'll know we're very fortunate to have Laura speak with us today. I mean, I've seen you speak a few times before, Laura, but I'll never tire of the passion and the enthusiasm that you bring to your presentations. And I still always learn something new, or at least I'm reminded of some very important aspect of this work. So for those of you that are not so familiar with Laura, Professor Laura Lundy is co-director of the Centre for Children's Rights and a professor of education and law and children's rights in the School of Social Sciences, Education and Social Work at Queen's University Belfast. She's co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Children's Rights. She's expertise in law and human rights with a particular focus on children's right to participate in decision-making and education rights. Her 2007 paper in the British Educational Research Journal, Voice is Not Enough, is one of the most highly cited academic papers in that journal on children's rights. And the model of children's participation it proposes is used extensively in scholarship and in practice, and it has informed the Children's Rights Centre, their rights-based approach to participatory research with children, including pioneering the use of children and young people's advisory groups. And that's what Laura is going to speak to us about today. So before I hand over to Laura, I just want to mention that Laura will speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. And then, we'd love space at the end for your questions. So please do turn on your microphone, raise your hand, use that function to raise your hand, and I'll call on you to turn on your microphone and ask a question directly. Alternatively, if you don't have access to a microphone, you can insert your question using the chat function. So over to you, Laura.
Okay, thank you so much, Danielle, for the introduction, and thank you to the network for the invitation to speak and share work. I'm just going to share my screen now. I mean, I think it's not an accident that it's happening in Ireland. I mean, there's just so much really excellent work, and I'm delighted to hear that this is a cross-university, cross-partnership network. I think Ireland leads the way in much of this work, and I think it's really exciting to see what's going to come out of this in terms of PPI, which is an area that I don't work in, but I'm really interested to hear across the next seminars, which I hope to attend, much more about it. What I've been asked to talk about then is really to explain our child rights-based approach to participation in research. And I want to do something slightly different on it. I mean, I think, as Danielle said, my background is in law and human rights, and my take on participation is always going to come from a human rights perspective. I mean, there are other routes into thinking about why we involve and how we involve, but I want to explain to you how, when you look at it through a child rights lens, where that took me and then where that took me in terms of my own research. So I'm not going to repeat this. I know that most of you will be familiar with this provision, but this is my starting point. My starting point was Article 12 of the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the child's right to have their views given due weight in accordance with the age and maturity. And I was thinking when I was reading around PPI in advance of this, and I think a lot of it is about justifying doing it, justifying why PPI is so important and so useful. And there's a growing body of evidence which shows why it's incredibly important to involve public and patients in these decisions. But from a rights-based perspective, we come at it a little differently. And that is really, in some ways, for me, it doesn't need justified at all, because, even if it had no consequence, it's just a fact. It's a fact that it's a human right, that children are actually entitled to this, and you shouldn't have to justify why they should be involved any more than you have to justify their right not to be tortured or subjected to degrading treatment. And it's a right for a reason. And the reason it's a right is that there's a sufficiency of interest in children in being treated equally without discrimination and having respect for their worth as a human person. And so much of our own worth is being able to self-determine, to influence decisions that are made for us. So that's where I came at it. It's not to say that we don't look for evidence in child rights terms of what the consequences and benefits are. But clearly one of the things is that this right that I'm focused on is not just a right in itself. It's a general principle that cuts across the whole of the Convention on the Rights of the Child. So applies to access to healthcare. And it's not just a right, it's a means of realizing other rights, and that makes it crucial. And I think that's where it starts to line up in some ways with the discourse and dialogue at PPI, is that we're looking to see that actually if you don't listen to children, it's going to be really hard to deliver their safety. It's going to be really hard to deliver decisions being made in their best interests. It's going to be really hard to deliver access to the best healthcare. So my start, I'm going to just go back a tiny bit, which I thought I would do for this, and that is to go where I started becoming interested in children's rights. And that was in a study for our Children's Commissioner, going back to 2003 and 2004, so way back. And that's where I first became more interested in child participation, having been a bit of a cynic about it. And in that study, what we found across all aspects of children's lives, including health and social care, is that there was a disconnect between what I knew was the legal text of Article 12, which is my first slide, what adults were telling us they were doing, and most of them hadn't heard of Article 12, but they were saying, no, it's in our professional competency framework. We have the voice of the child really central, or we do the pupil voice or student voice. And then we had this data, lots and lots of data from children and young people across Northern Ireland who were telling us that their views were not being sought. And if they were sought, they were not being taken seriously, or sometimes they were being dismissed or seen to be cheeky. So this disconnect was where I was at in 2003 and 2004. And I became increasingly uncomfortable with this notion of voice. Okay, I'll get there. I'm not going to talk about this. I think most people will know this Lundy model of child participation. I don't often use the original diagram because lots of people with lots of really good design skills have made much nicer versions of it than I ever could. But this is the original version, which is in the British Educational Research Journal. And I'm coming back to it a lot more recently because what I was trying to do then was connect this right to be heard, this right to be involved with the other rights in the convention, the right not to be discriminated against, best interest, to be safe. And crucially, I think for us today, the right to seek, receive, and impart information. So that's where I was at, and that's the study. But then what happened after that was it was submitted in 2005 and published, accepted in 2006, published in 2007. And meanwhile, what happened in our team was that I had put this model out and I put it out to others. This is how duty bearers, as I saw them, should behave. So this is how social workers and doctors and nurses and teachers and lawyers should behave with children. And then we had like a light bulb moment, and that was we weren't doing it ourselves. We weren't actually Lundy model compliant. We had gone, if I go back to that original study that formed the Lundy model, and I'm not saying we didn't get good data and that you can't get good data without doing this, but that actually our own research processes were not child rights compliant. We had not involved children in determining what needed asked. We had not involved children in determining how it should be asked, what it meant, or actually really meaningfully being involved in dissemination. And we started to think to ourselves, what would it look like? What would research look like if we put the Lundy model onto it? And that actually took us down another line, and we started to think about this was what I think at the time as a kind of typology of participation. I don't know, and this is something I'm just playing with, so it'd be great to get some comments or questions on it. And I think it's like a history of where we used to be at, which was, and in some cases we still are, is that people don't ask children directly about their experiences. They ask parents and guardians, and sometimes they have to if the children are very young. And that's like proxies. Then we just had children as participants, which is what we were doing in the NICI study and the Children's Commissioner study. Those children were just participants. They were not involved in shaping it, informing it, or helping us understand it. Then there's common use of children, going in and doing pilots with children so that you actually are a bit more geared towards what's actually important to children or what's working in your research methods. And then finally, I think where most of us who are in this room must be, and that is thinking differently about that. And that's where we started to think, well, what it would be like if we as research decision makers applied Article 12 and the rest of the convention to ourselves, that we would have to enter into some kind of partnership. So this is what happened. We then said, right, we can no longer choose not to do this because this is one of the most cited bits of the original Lundy model. It's not the gift of adults, it's the right of the child. And if we accept this, going back, that this is an entitlement, so it's not just that we are deciding in research that we bestow this opportunity on children to come into PPI, that actually if we see it as they're entitled to be consulted as a collective, as a group, on issues affecting them, then the question becomes, how do we make that happen? And how do we make that happen in the context of our sometimes strange and restricted research lives? And that took us then to this idea of, well, what does a children's rights-based approach mean? And there are various definitions of children's rights-based, including one from the Committee on the Rights of the Child. But with my colleague, Leslie Emerson McAvoy, we settled at the time at looking at this particular definition that comes from a statement of common understanding of what a human rights-based approach to programming is. It wasn't about research, it's about programming. And we adapted it for research. And we define it this way. A children's rights-based approach means that we're looking to further the realization of children's human rights, which means in practice and research that we research children's human rights. We research their experience and enjoyment of their rights, whether they're being implemented or what they think should be done to implement them. Secondly, which is what I'll focus on mostly today, is that actually the standards should guide the process. And if you want to engage children in your research and you want to do it in a human rights compliant way, this effectively is the Lundy model applied, is that it should be inclusive, meaningful and safe, children with opportunities to express themselves freely and all the matters affecting them. And then thirdly and finally, it's research with purpose, that you could contributing to the development of the capacities of the duty bearers to meet obligations, but particularly for us, the rights holders, to be able to claim their rights. So that's not a new frame, that is a very established human rights definition, but what we did was adapt it. And then we had to think, well, what does that mean for us in research? And realizing that a lot of our research is commissioned, by bodies who have a research agenda. and we applied to tenders to do this research. We also applied to get original research done. It's much harder to do, particularly involving children. We're still pushing on that. But when we're doing commissioned research, someone has given us a topic. And the question then is, well, how do we involve children? And that's where we come up with this idea very pragmatically at the time of the first core feature is that we needed to work with children. And within that Lundy model frame was we were decision makers and we were involving them and helping us shape decisions. We were seeking their views in everything that we could find, and we were taking their views into account. And we just naturally, it actually happened in a strange way, which I've never really talked about before. We were in the middle of another project, an ASRC funded project, and we were working with children who were research participants when this dawned on us. And we suddenly realized we should ask these children how to do the research, not just ask them questions. And we just changed those groups. They became our first CRAG, our first Children's Research Advisory Group. They morphed into it, changed the ethics, and suddenly we had partners. And we've done a lot since that. That was 2006. And since then, we have been working on this idea of Children's Research Advisory Groups and Young People's Research Advisory Groups. Now, that is a really common thing now, but at that time, it was not happening. No one was doing that. And it wasn't that we set out to have an agenda. It just flowed into that from thinking what would a rights-based approach look like. And I suppose many of you use these groups. And for us, the most crucial thing with them is that whenever you have a research agenda where you're going to have children as participants, that we try to establish a children's research, a CRAG or a YPAG, called lots of different things, that is as close as possible to the children who will be the research participants, the research subjects. And so, for instance, there's one that was in a study on children's the children with disabilities experience of the digital environment for Europe. You'll work with children with disabilities, will not work with children who don't have disabilities to be advisors in that group. And in the second one, which I'm going to come back to, we were working on a consultation for the Committee on the Rights of the Child and Children's Involvement in Budgeting. And we wanted to consult younger children and older children. So we needed to establish a group of younger children. In this case, the children who are there were children who were 5 and 6. So it just depends. And that's the kind of crucial thing, is you're trying to get those insights that you couldn't possibly have and other children couldn't have unless they have that kind of experience. So they're not research participants for us. So what they tell us is not data, but I don't know if any of you who are in the field are getting a bit of blurring here, because we're certainly getting it. We're getting some of our CRAGs and YPRAGs come back and going, but we want to give you data. We don't want our stories and our views out. So we're having to amend our ethics at time to say, well, you're in this part, you're functioning with us as an advisory group, and then you're a participant, and it's running it both ways. And that came from children and young people themselves. It's not child-led and it's not peer research. Now, those were the other things that were very common at the time. There was, a child-led movement. Mary Kellett's work was really strong and is really strong, of course, the Open University. There was peer research happening in our own, in Northern Ireland that was really strong. Sometimes our advisors will want to do that, and that's where we'll go with our research, but sometimes they don't. But it's an advisory model that we have. And their job is to advise us in all stages of the research, the consultation, or the programming. So what we do is, of course, that we involve them in choosing research questions. Often we have the briefing. We've been commissioned to do research on children with disabilities in the digital environment. That's what the Council of Europe wanted to know. But within that, the children help us shape the questions that should be asked. They help us shape the choice of methods, what's appropriate. And again, in that, we don't usually go and say, what do you think? Because we see ourselves as expert professional researchers. And usually we'll go along and say, we're thinking about doing this. Do you think this will work? Is there anything else that you think would be better than that you think would work? And then we'll add that in as well. So it's actually giving choices, open choices, and then some closed choices, explain this is what we want to do, help us do it better. Obviously, if they told us it wasn't going to work, we wouldn't do it at all. We involve children in interpretation of data, so that when we get our findings, that we will work with children and young people to say, what meaning do you give this? Sometimes we present that alongside our interpretation if we've done it separately, and then we'll write it up saying, this is this is how we saw it, this is what our advisory group saw. Sometimes we'll integrate it, but we try to make it clear whenever the interpretation comes from young people, because that has a power and effect in itself. And again, as far as possible, we try to involve them in dissemination. I'll come back at the end to say we don't always pull this off, and time and efforts and children's interests and lives don't always let us pull this off, but this is our hope. This is our hope, is that we try to get this across all of our research. Second feature then, apart from working with children advisory groups, is a little bit different, and that is that we came around to thinking again about the fact that in some cases, particularly working with children as a group, we would hear people saying, well, we went and talked to them and they had nothing to say. You know, they didn't really understand it. And we thought, well, that is from a child rights-based approach, applying again the Lundy model into that, you can't just let that go. Because when we started to think, this is Leslie Emerson and myself, well, what would it look like if we had a rights-based approach to being heard and to information? And we come up with this extra model, which is really looking from a child rights perspective, is that we work with our advisory groups and sometimes our participants, which gets more controversial in research terms, to enable them to understand issues, not their lived experience. We don't have to say to them, have you been bullied? But if we're putting to a young person, in your context, you know, what would be a better way to deliver health and social care? You know, they might not have known anything but what they know. They don't have options in their head. And like all of us, we want information about what the possibilities are. So we will work with our groups and say, giving them information. So this will give them samples of, you know, summaries of literature reviews. This is what the research tells us. These are what other countries are doing. These are options. So we're guiding. We're not leading as far as possible. And, you know, at times that can be a tricky thing, but we are informing them so that they can come to a formed and informed view, which they can then express. So again, this is an unusual part of our process, but one that we don't always need to use. But whenever we realize it's a complex topic, like if you're talking to 5-year-olds about public budgeting, you know, how their government spend money, that's something they won't have thought about before, but it's something they can talk about. And I'll come back to that. I'll come back to it right now. So we build our child advisors' capacity to understand issues. And here's the UN Committee on the Rights of the Child making this point, I think, really well. And that is the child's right to information is essential because it's a precondition of a clarified decision. And I think that's something to think about, is how do we go about doing that? How do we involve them and how do we not lead? And back to that little photograph, why I put it up again is with this advisory group of children, because they were very young, they were 5 and 6, and it was a really complex topic, government spending for the realization of children's rights, public budgeting. And, you know, we were finding ways with them that we were then able to roll out with our participants. And in this case, the thing that helped us a lot was this IKEA toy mat, because on that IKEA toy mat has every public institution. and from a child rights perspective, it's gold. Just putting it out to you, because I could tell everybody about this, and particularly those of you thinking about health and social services, you know, you've got your hospital, you've got your doctor's clinic, you've got your school, you've got your playground, you've got your police, you've got your ambulance, you've got your fire, they're all on the mat. And it just enables you to have a conversation with them about their lives, about these people, about government spending money. And that then Matt was then carried through as a process, because it worked really well with the advisory group and they were keen on it, and also Monopoly Money, but we'll talk about that later. So that's it in a nutshell. I wanted to keep it really short. We've written a lot about it. You can read it. We have done many, many studies since where we've applied it, sometimes really well, and sometimes ways in which were disappointing to us, because that is all of child participation, ways that we felt we couldn't do enough, we hadn't enough, we couldn't sustain it right through, but other times when we've done it pretty well, never perfectly, but pretty well. But because I think I don't work in this space, and that's why I'm really interested to hear how you all are in this space, PPI. But recently, last year, we did a project for BBC Children in Need, and I just thought I'd really briefly talk about that. Wasn't a research project, it was a demonstration project for BBC Children in Need to look at how they would involve children and young people in their work. Now, I'm sure you all know who they are. They're a big charitable organisation who raise money and give it out across UK and elsewhere for projects involving children. And they now have quite a large specific project called 1 Million in Me. And 1 Million in Me is targeted at children aged 9 to 13 and their mental health. And it's trying to capture children before they need mental health services. So it's a kind of form of social prescription where they're trying to fund projects that might help children who might end up having mental health problems. So we worked with BBC Children in Need, applying the Lundy model, but again, in a programmatic way. And what we did was, of course, we established an advisory group because we want to show them that they should be doing that. And they already are, actually, to be fair, in different parts of BBC Children in Need. But this is a specific group that we established. We did it in Scotland, but we decided to do it not in Northern Ireland, to do it in one of the regions. And we did it with a Scottish group of children recruited through the Children in Need project partners in 1 Million in Me. And we had 10 children who were aged 9 to 13 who were advising on how 1 Million in Me should be delivered. So basically what the principles would be, where money should go, what, all of those kinds of things. And just, I can't do in my time, but I just wanted to give you a little edited highlights. So one of the things is, of course, we're trying to create this comfortable space. This is a space where children feel included, where they don't feel, they feel safe to speak, and they feel they belong ultimately in this place. It's a place where they can be heard. And one of the things that we find really helpful when we're doing these projects like this one is to get an identity in our group, is that they create their own logo. And that's what Danielle will remember this from a project we did in Participation for Protection, where the very first thing we did with our group was we created the logo for Participation Protection. And that little act actually gives ownership. And those children and young people felt this was their project. They called themselves, I've cut it off here, the Million and Me Squad, which actually the person BBC Children in Need was saying, they can't call themselves a squad, that's like football. But of course, squad is the trendy term. Now kids all want to be in a squad. So they were the Million and Me Squad. And you can see what they did. They designed this and we sat with them, and one little girl, it was all about mental health and trying to capture again those children before there were serious mental health problems. And she came up with these 3 hearts that the other children liked. So there's the heart that's fine, there's the heart that's broken. This is the child where it's, struggling with mental health issues. And then there was a little cracking heart, and the little cracking heart is the target for this Million and Me program. And then they didn't want it to look too sad, so they wanted a rainbow. They loved Pudsey, so Pudsey was everywhere, and we had to keep Pudsey in it to make sure everyone knew it was BBC Children in Need. But again, that shaping that comfort and that identity and those kind of activities. In terms of voice, one of the things that I think we all struggle with, or not struggle with, but that we need to attend to, is a better way of putting this, when we work with children and young people, is having this shared language, is understanding how they describe things and how we describe things, and I think that one of the things, again, that we will do is find that shared language. But that was really important in A Million and Me, because they really wanted to be able to explain to children in children's terms who this group were. So we worked with these children, and we have these little stick people that we get in the pawn shop. And you can write and draw on them, and they're just so useful in so many projects because children and young people love them. And we talked to them about getting that language, and you can see they were identifying these 3 groups of children who were coping with their mental health, and they called that handling it or getting on with it. Children who were beginning to struggle, and you can see their language around that is confused and anxious and unsure. And then the children who were struggling to cope. And so what we did with them is they put characteristics onto these children, and we got that language, and we got activities, and we got a shaping to identify who that middle group were, what they might be feeling, what they would be feeling if actually things were getting worse, and what they would be feeling like if they were fine. And again, that activity is part of our capacity building, because our advisory group need to understand who it is in A Million and Me, that it's a target group. And you can't just go in and tell them in your language, because that is not always the way that they understand it. You can start with that and then see how they see that, and then how they feel about it. In terms of audience, this is a crucial part of the Lundy model, and that is that we look for these dedicated listeners, that we don't believe it's taking part for its own sake. It's participation with purpose, that we want to be sure that it's going to affect change. And you can't do that if you haven't identified the right people. And I think there's not always one right person. Clearly the crucial person for us was Patty Sloan, who's the director of A Million and Me program, and she came to everything and totally took it on board, and has taken it on into BBC to spread it on out and had us in training on BBC Children in So again, these are the children being heard and making sure that she was there, that she was feeding back, that she was saying what was possible, what was not possible, what she was taking forward. We also, because we were in Scotland, got them off to meet the Scottish Children's Commissioner, which is really useful for them to talk about that, and that as their work and his response to that, and what he's doing in mental health. And then the final pictures of the evaluator of the programme, because she was creating evaluation forms for children, and we were really clear that evaluation forms for children had to be designed with our Million and Me squad. They had to have that input, so that what was evaluated, what was important to them. And my final slide then on this is about influence, which is, the holy grail of child rights and child participation, is that, giving views due weight. And the audience is really crucial to that, and making sure you get them. So even me coming to you today, I see that as part of spreading out, what they found, what they thought, so that you can take it forward, and that's giving their work, although they've disseminated themselves, of course. And one of the things was really crucial in BBC Children in Need was there'd been principles established for projects, as there are for the general BBC Children in Need. and Paddy Sloan, the director, had written them, and we showed them to the children. They called them Paddy's principles. They just said, you know, they're rubbish, and throw them out. And so Paddy had to abandon her principles, and they wrote their own principles. And these are the principles for all projects that will get funded under BBC Children in Need, that these are their criteria. This is what was important to them that every project should do, particularly in the context of A Million in Me, given its target audience. And so we worked with them on that. So concluding, it's not without its challenges. Having done it, I find it really hard not to do it, you know, because once you do it and you work with children and young people and you see what they see and you know what they know that you couldn't have known, or how they, you know, what they want to know, how they want to know it, how to make it ethical, which I haven't had time to talk about, is that it's very hard not to do it. But we have challenges. Sometimes, as I mentioned at the start, we begin without our children because we're commissioned. So you have to start somewhere, and sometimes we have to start without children, young people. Sometimes we start with children, young people, but we just have to recognize that the pragmatism of that is it's better to get them involved as soon as you can rather than not to do it at all. We have baffled our research ethics committee, and we now know how to get research ethics approval for this and beyond, but it still raises heads. And I think we've got one of the most complex research application forms ever, because we keep having to add things in every time another ethics committee looks at it. Big challenge is establishing advisory groups that are representative. I mean, that's a challenge for all of us. I think we didn't do that so well in the early days. You know, if you look at that project on public budgeting, we used a Northern Ireland group because we thought it was pragmatic. We've got much better at that now. We've just led a really large study on COVID under 19, it's called, and we had an advisory group with hundreds of children across the world working in different languages. We've just learned how to do it and get better, and being online actually has helped us in some ways. And then the final challenge is always seeing it through to the end. It's just being sure that you sustain your involvement, you sustain your interest, and that you sustain children's interest. And it's quite hard to break up. Again, as Danielle maybe knows in the project we did with her, our little group there really did not want to let go. And actually we did it work with them in primary school, and then they insisted, even though they all went to different secondary schools, that we got new permissions from their parents to bring them all back together again, because they really had formed a bond with each other and with us. But at times it is for a purpose and being really clear that it will end. So that's me. I'm really open to any questions that you may have, and thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura. And, thank you. It was a really excellent and very honest presentation. So